January 2005. Flames tore through the north wing of one of England's most magnificent Gothic Revival castles. The main dining room, where Victorian nobility once feasted beneath carved oak ceilings, became an inferno. The library, its bookcases designed in the style of Augustus Pugin himself, crumbled into ash. 2 centuries of history seemed destined to vanish in a single night. As firefighters battled the blaze in the frozen Yorkshire darkness, many believed they were witnessing the final chapter of Allerton Castle. They were wrong. This was merely the latest crisis in a story spanning nearly 1,000 years, a tale of Norman conquerors, a legendary duke, mysterious temples, Catholic persecution, wartime secrets, and an American visionary who would risk everything to save England's Gothic masterpiece from oblivion. This is the story of Allerton Castle, a house that died and rose from the ashes not once but twice. A palace that witnessed the birth of a nursery rhyme, sheltered bomber crews plotting the defeat of Nazi Germany, and stands today as testament to one man's obsession with preserving the impossible. To understand how a castle could survive fire, war, abandonment, and the passage of nearly 10 centuries, we must travel back to 1066, to the moment when William the Conqueror's army forever changed the fate of England, and granted a small estate in North Yorkshire to a family whose name would echo through history. The year 1066 marks the beginning of our story, though the land itself had been inhabited far longer. When William the Conqueror distributed England's conquered territories among his Norman knights, the estate of Allerton fell to a warrior whose descendants would adopt the name Mauleverer, derived from the French mal lever, meaning bad riser or evil awakening, a curious epithet whose origins remain shrouded in medieval mystery. For 6 centuries, the Mauleverer family ruled this corner of Yorkshire, 10 miles east of what would eventually become the spa town of Harrogate. The original manor house, likely a fortified Norman structure, evolved through the centuries, rebuilt, expanded, modified according to the architectural fashions of each successive age, through the Wars of the Roses, through the religious upheavals of the Tudor period, through civil war and restoration, the Mauleverers endured. But every dynasty must end. In 1692, Richard Mauleverer died without producing an heir, the first crack in a lineage that had survived 6 centuries. The estate passed to his widow, a woman whose name history has partially obscured, but whose decision would redirect Allerton's destiny. She had remarried after Richard's death, and when her own time came, she bequeathed Allerton not to distant Mauleverer cousins, but to her son from that second marriage, Richard Arundel. Richard Arundel was a man of refined tastes and scholarly inclinations, characteristics that would leave an indelible mark on Allerton. In 1745 he undertook a remarkable project, the complete remodelling of the nearby St. Martin's Church in Norman Revival style, an early example of the Gothic Revival movement that would not fully flourish until nearly a century later. Arundel's church, with its rounded arches and solid fortress-like walls, represented a romanticisation of medieval architecture that was just beginning to capture the imagination of England's educated classes. The church interior that Arundel created in 1745 remains virtually unaltered to this day, a time capsule of mid-18th century antiquarian taste. Within its walls lie 2 monuments to generations of Mauleverers, silent witnesses to the family that had ruled Allerton for 600 years, to stand in St. Martin's Church today is to occupy the same space that Richard Arundel designed nearly 3 centuries ago, to see the same Norman-style arches, the same medieval-inspired details that captured his imagination in an age when most English aristocrats were demolishing Gothic structures to build fashionable Palladian mansions. Richard Arundel died in 1758. The estate passed to his widow, Lady Frances Arundel, who lived there alone for 11 years, a solitary chatelaine managing lands and tenants in an era when such independence for women was rare. When Lady Frances died in 1769, Allerton passed to her nephew, Viscount Galway, continuing the pattern of inheritance through female lines that had characterised the estate since the Mauleverer extinction. Viscount Galway never developed the deep attachment to Allerton that his predecessors had known. For him, it was one property among many, and when his son Robert Monckton Arundel inherited the title and became the 4th Viscount Galway, the younger man's ambitions lay elsewhere. Nevertheless, around 1780, the 4th Viscount undertook a significant rebuilding of the house according to designs attributed to William Lindley, transforming the medieval manor into a Georgian mansion of classical proportions, elegant, symmetrical, fashionable. But the 4th Viscount Galway's tenure would be brief. In 1786, just 6 years after completing his Georgian remodelling, he sold Allerton Castle to one of the most famous and infamous men in England, Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, second son of King George III and brother to the Prince of Wales, who would become George Thor. The arrival of the Duke of York at Allerton marks the beginning of the estate's most legendary chapter, a period when this remote Yorkshire property would become entangled with nursery rhymes, military controversy, and one of the most peculiar monuments in English architecture. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, was born in 1763, the second son of George III and Queen Charlotte. In the rigid hierarchy of royal succession, he lived in the shadow of his older brother, the dissolute and spendthrift Prince of Wales, yet Frederick carved out his own identity as a military man, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army from 1795 to 1809, and again from 1811 until his death in 1827. But in 1786, when the 23-year-old Duke purchased Allerton from Viscount Galway, his military career lay ahead. He was a young prince with a generous income from Parliament, expensive tastes, and a hunger for country estates befitting his royal status. Allerton, with its hundreds of acres of Yorkshire parkland and recently renovated Georgian mansion, seemed an ideal retreat from London's watchful eyes. The Duke wasted no time in putting his stamp on the property. In 1788, just 2 years after purchase, he employed Henry Holland, one of London's most fashionable architects known for his work on Carlton House for the Prince of Wales, to remodel the interior. Holland's touch brought Regency elegance to Allerton, refined plasterwork, fashionable colour schemes, rooms designed for the sophisticated entertainments of late Georgian society. Yet even as Holland's craftsmen were finishing their work, the Duke of York was already losing interest. In 1789, barely 3 years after purchasing the estate, and before Holland's renovations were fully complete, the Duke sold Allerton to Thomas Thornton, a wealthy sportsman and eccentric, known for his passion for falconry and extravagant lifestyle. Why did the Duke of York abandon Allerton so quickly? The answer likely lies in the perpetual financial difficulties that plagued George III's sons. Despite generous parliamentary allowances, the Duke's expenses constantly outran his income. Maintaining a Yorkshire estate far from London proved expensive and inconvenient for a prince whose duties increasingly tied him to the capital and to military affairs on the continent. But before departing Allerton, the Duke of York, or perhaps Thomas Thornton in the brief period of overlap, commissioned one of the strangest and most enduring monuments in Yorkshire, the Temple of Victory. Today, travellers on the A1 motorway see it in the distance, an octagonal structure of Palladian design perched atop an artificial hill rising 200 feet above the surrounding landscape. The Temple of Victory, now Grade 2 listed, commands the countryside for miles around, a classical temple seemingly transported from ancient Rome to the Yorkshire moors. The construction of this enormous mound required hundreds of workers labouring day after day, carrying countless baskets of earth up the steadily rising hill. Local legend claims that the sight of these workers, ascending with full baskets, descending with empty ones, an endless ant-like procession up and down the growing mound, inspired the famous nursery rhyme, "The Grand Old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men, he marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again." Is this legend true? Like many oral traditions, it occupies that ambiguous space between history and folklore. The rhyme first appeared in print in the early 19th century, during the Duke of York's later military career, and is generally interpreted as satirical commentary on his disastrous 1799 military campaign in Holland during the French Revolutionary Wars, a campaign where Frederick's forces were indeed marched up and down with little strategic success, yet the coincidence is tantalizing. Here was the grand old Duke of York, owner of Allerton in the late 1780s, at precisely the time when this enormous hill was being constructed through the labour of hundreds, perhaps metaphorically 10,000, men, literally marching up and down day after day. Whether the rhyme originated from observation of the temple's construction or from later military failures, or whether the two became conflated in popular memory, the association has proven indelible. To this day, locals point to the Temple of Victory and recount the story, and visitors stand at its base imagining the endless procession of workers whose labour created this improbable monument. The temple itself, when finally completed, was magnificent, an octagonal structure of perfectly proportioned Palladian classicism, with columns supporting a domed roof, opening to views across the Yorkshire countryside. From its elevated position, one could see for miles in every direction the ancient forest of Knaresborough to the west, the rich agricultural lands of the Vale of York to the east, the distant moors to the north. It was a folly in the grandest sense, a structure built for contemplation and aesthetic effect rather than practical purpose, a monument to wealth, taste, and the power to reshape the landscape itself. Whether the Duke of York ever climbed that hill to enjoy the view from his temple remains unknown. By 1789 he had departed Allerton forever, selling the estate to Thomas Thornton for reasons of financial necessity or simply royal restlessness. Thomas Thornton, the new owner, was himself a remarkable character, a wealthy landowner who would spend a fortune on his passion for falconry, eventually publishing a famous illustrated volume on the subject. But Thornton's tenure at Allerton would also prove brief, lasting only 16 years. In 1805, the estate changed hands once more, purchased by a man whose family would finally provide Allerton with the stability and continuity it had lacked since the Mauleverer extinction, the 17th Baron Storton, a Catholic peer whose descendants would own Allerton for the next 178 years. The arrival of the Storton family marks the beginning of Allerton's transformation into the Gothic masterpiece we know today, but that transformation would not occur immediately. First would come decades of Catholic adaptation, the addition of a private chapel, and the slow accumulation of wealth and confidence that would finally allow the 19th Baron Storton to undertake the most ambitious architectural project in Allerton's long history, the complete demolition of the Georgian house and the construction, in its place, of a Victorian Gothic palace on a scale unprecedented in Yorkshire. When the 17th Baron Stourton purchased Allerton in 1805, he acquired more than a country estate. He gained a refuge. The Stourtons were one of England's oldest Catholic families, direct descendants of medieval nobility, who had refused to abandon their faith during the Protestant Reformation and its aftermath. For nearly 3 centuries, English Catholics had lived under varying degrees of legal restriction and social stigma, barred from holding public office, from attending universities, from sitting in Parliament, subject to special taxes and periodic persecution. The situation had improved somewhat by 1805. The Catholic Relief Acts of 1778 and 1791 had lifted some of the most onerous restrictions, though full Catholic emancipation would not arrive until 1829. Still, Catholic peers like Baron Storton remained socially marginal, their grand titles unable to secure them seats in the House of Lords, their ancient lineage counting for little in a Protestant establishment that viewed Catholicism with lingering suspicion. At Allerton, far from London's hostile atmosphere, Baron Stourton could practice his faith without scrutiny. The estate became known as Storton House, and in 1807, just 2 years after purchase, the Baron commissioned the construction of a private chapel, a necessity for Catholic families who could not always rely on access to public Catholic churches in Protestant England. The chapel was probably designed by Peter Atkinson, a York architect known for his work in the Gothic style, that early, somewhat playful version of Gothic Revival characterised by pointed arches, decorative battlements, and medieval-inspired details applied more for aesthetic effect than archaeological accuracy. The Allerton Chapel, constructed of a distinctive mixture of brown and cream brick with a slate roof, featured a 3-bay nave, a crossing, and a 1-bay chancel. Its windows were simple lancets, tall, narrow, pointed arch openings that recalled medieval ecclesiastical architecture. What made the chapel particularly remarkable was its integration into the house itself. The entrance opened directly from the main building at the west end, allowing the family to attend Mass without stepping outdoors, essential for privacy and convenience. Above the entrance, a balcony provided access directly from the master bedroom, enabling the Baron or his successors to observe services without joining the congregation below, an arrangement suggesting both piety and privilege. The chapel's interior was designed to inspire devotion through architectural beauty. Though the original decoration has been modified over the centuries, we can imagine the atmosphere the 17th Baron Storton sought to create. Candlelight flickering against cream-coloured walls, the smell of incense, the murmur of Latin prayers, the sense of sanctuary and separation from the Protestant world beyond the estate's boundaries. For nearly 40 years, the Georgian house with its Gothic chapel served the Storton family well, but by the 1840s architectural tastes had shifted dramatically. The Regency elegance of Holland's interior now seemed cold and lifeless. The Georgian mansion's symmetrical facade appeared boring compared to the romantic irregularity of authentic medieval architecture. The Gothic Revival, which had begun as a playful Gothic fancy in the late 18th century, had matured into something far more serious and scholarly. This transformation was driven largely by one man, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, the brilliant, obsessive architect and theorist whose writings and buildings revolutionized English architecture. Pugin's 1836 book, Contrasts, and his 1841 masterwork, The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, argued passionately that Gothic architecture was not merely a style, but the only morally and aesthetically correct form of building for Christian civilization. For Pugin, Gothic represented truth, honesty, and spiritual authenticity, while classical architecture embodied pagan falsehood. Pugin's ideas found particularly receptive audiences among Catholic patrons, for whom Gothic architecture carried additional resonance as the style of medieval England's Catholic past. To build in Gothic was to assert continuity with the pre-Reformation Church, to reject the Protestant classical tradition, to proclaim one's faith through architectural form. The 19th Baron Storton, who had inherited the title, and Allerton from his father, the 17th Baron, absorbed these ideas completely. By 1843 he had made an extraordinary decision. He would demolish the Georgian house entirely and construct in its place a Gothic palace on a scale that would rival the greatest country houses in England. To realise this vision, Baron Stourton turned to George Martin, an architect based on London's Baker Street. Martin was not as famous as Pugin or Charles Barry, the designers of the new Palace of Westminster then under construction, but he was thoroughly versed in the Tudor Gothic style that combined the vertical drama of perpendicular Gothic with the domestic details of Tudor architecture: tall towers, battlemented parapets, carved stone finials, mullioned windows, and the dark, richly carved interiors that Pugin had made fashionable. In 1843, demolition began. The Georgian mansion that the 4th Viscount Galway had built in 1780, that Henry Holland had refined in 1788, that had sheltered the Duke of York and Thomas Thornton, and 2 generations of Stourtons. This entire structure was torn down, reduced to rubble, its elegant proportions sacrificed to the new Gothic vision. What arose in its place would take 10 years to complete, and even then would remain partly unfinished for another century and a half. The construction of Allerton Castle, for it was now truly a castle, no longer a mere country house, represents one of the most ambitious private building projects of the Victorian era. George Martin's design called for a structure that would dwarf its Georgian predecessor, a Gothic palace that would announce the Stourton family's wealth, taste, and Catholic pride to all Yorkshire. The process began with careful planning. Martin and his patron studied medieval precedents, examined authentic Gothic details, consulted with stone carvers and craftsmen who understood traditional techniques. This was not Gothic playfulness, but serious archaeological revivalism, attempting to recreate not just the appearance but the construction methods and spiritual atmosphere of medieval architecture. The labour force was substantial, though exact numbers are lost to history. We can estimate that hundreds of workers were employed at the peak of construction, Stonemasons, carvers, carpenters, plasterers, glaziers, ironworkers, common labourers. Some came from York, England's ancient Gothic city 15 miles to the east, bringing skills passed down through generations of cathedral maintenance. Others were recruited from farther afield, London, even continental Europe, wherever Martin could find craftsmen capable of executing his designs to the required standard. The primary building material was dark-coloured stone, likely quarried locally from Yorkshire's abundant limestone deposits. This stone, weathering to sombre browns and greys, gave the castle its brooding, romantic appearance, very different from the pale Bath stone or white Portland stone favoured for classical architecture. The dark stone was both practically and aesthetically significant. Practically, it was readily available and durable. Aesthetically, it conveyed age, permanence, connection to the English landscape and medieval past. The construction proceeded in stages. First, the main block rose from the foundations of the demolished Georgian house, its footprint larger and its height more dramatic than its predecessor. The central feature was a high tower rising above the entrance porch, visible for miles around, announcing Allerton's presence in the landscape, just as medieval castles had once dominated their territories. This was not a defensive structure. Victorian England had no need of fortifications, but a symbolic one, asserting continuity with the feudal past, when the Mauleverers had ruled these lands as military lords. As the walls rose, the enormous scale of Martin's design became apparent. The great hall at the castle's heart would be galleried, rising nearly 70 feet, 21 metres, to a vast lantern that would flood the interior with light. This height was extraordinary, even for Victorian Gothic, rivaling the baronial halls of Scotland and the great medieval chambers of castles like Warwick and Windsor. To achieve such height required sophisticated engineering, massive timber roof trusses, stone vaulting, careful calculation of weight distribution and structural loads. Simultaneously, craftsmen worked on the decorative details that would transform bare stone into architectural splendour. Stone carvers worked from Martin's drawings and from medieval exemplars to create the carved finials, gargoyles, crocketed pinnacles, and decorative tracery that adorned the exterior. Every window was a mullioned composition of Gothic design, some with pointed arches, others with the flattened Tudor arch that gave the style its name. The roofline was a picturesque silhouette of gables, chimneys and castellations, that distinctive feature of Gothic Revival where the roofline became a kind of stone lace against the sky. The chapel that the 17th Baron Stourton had built in 1807 was retained and integrated into the new structure. The lower brick range to the right of the main entrance housed this chapel, its brown and cream brickwork contrasting with the dark stone of the main block, a visual reminder of the estate's history, the earlier Gothic enthusiasm of a previous generation preserved within the more ambitious Gothic vision of a later one. Behind the main castle, the service courtyard took shape, utilising older 18th century buildings and adding new structures as needed. Victorian country houses required vast service infrastructure: kitchens, sculleries, pantries, wine cellars, servants' halls, housekeepers' rooms, storage for coal, wood, ice, food, linens, china, silver. A great house like Allerton might employ 40, 50, even 60 servants, each requiring workspace and often living quarters. The service areas, though less architecturally distinguished than the main house, were essential to its functioning, and their design required as much careful planning as the formal rooms. By 1853, 10 years after demolition of the Georgian house, the main structure was complete, at least externally. But here the project encountered a problem that would haunt Allerton for more than a century: money. The cost of construction, though unrecorded in surviving documents, was certainly enormous. Stone carving alone represented thousands of hours of skilled labour, each Gothic window tracery pattern carved by hand, each decorative element individually crafted. The Great Hall's timber roof structure required massive oak beams, expensive even in an era when British forests were far more extensive than today. Stained glass, commissioned for the principal rooms, was costly, each window a collaboration between designer and glazier, the coloured glass itself expensive to produce, the leading and installation requiring specialist skills.
By 1856, just 3 years after the exterior's completion, work ground to a halt. The 19th Baron Stourton had exhausted his available funds. The shell was finished, the building was weathertight, but many interiors remained incomplete: bare masonry where panelling should be, plain plaster where elaborate decoration was planned, spaces designed for specific purposes but left unfinished, waiting for resources that would not arrive for generations. This partial completion would shape Allerton's destiny for the next 130 years. The castle was inhabitable. The family moved in, received guests, maintained their Catholic traditions in the integrated chapel. But it remained an unfinished dream, its full potential unrealized, whole rooms left in limbo between conception and completion. Yet even incomplete, Allerton Castle was magnificent. The parts that were finished demonstrated craftsmanship of the highest order, and the overall composition, the dark stone mass rising against Yorkshire skies, the high tower, the romantic silhouette, fulfilled the Gothic Revival's promise of beauty, grandeur, and connection to England's medieval heritage. For the next 8 decades, Allerton would serve the Stourton family as country seat, Catholic sanctuary, and symbol of aristocratic continuity. Then came 1939, and everything changed. September 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. Within months, the entire character of English life would be transformed as the nation mobilized for total war. Country houses across England were requisitioned by the military, converted to hospitals, training centres, prisoner of war camps, headquarters for operations that would determine the war's outcome. Allerton Castle's transformation was particularly significant. The Royal Canadian Air Force, forming RAF Bomber Command's No. 6 Group RCAF, needed a headquarters location in Yorkshire, close to the bomber stations that dotted the county, airfields like Linton-on-Ouse, Leeming, Skipton-on-Swale, Topcliffe, where young Canadian airmen would take off night after night to bomb Germany's industrial cities. Allerton's location was ideal, far enough from major cities to be relatively safe from German bombing, yet close enough to the bomber stations for effective command and control. Its size, those dozens of rooms the 19th Baron Stourton had built a century earlier, could accommodate the substantial staff required for modern military operations: intelligence officers, navigation specialists, meteorologists, operations planners, communications personnel, administrative staff. The Gothic Great Hall, built for Victorian entertaining, became an operations room. The elegant drawing room, with its plaster ceiling and ancestral portraits, transformed into a briefing area where Canadian officers planned raids on Hamburg, Berlin, the Ruhr. The dining room, where the Storton family had feasted beneath stained glass windows bearing their coats of arms, now served meals to military personnel far from home. Imagine the contrast: medieval Gothic architecture, designed to evoke chivalry and feudal loyalty, now housing the most modern instruments of warfare. Telephones, radio equipment, plotting tables, the bureaucracy of industrialized killing. Young Canadians, many from farms and small towns, suddenly found themselves working in a Victorian Gothic castle that seemed transported from a historical novel. RAF Bomber Command's No. 6 Group RCAF operated from October 1942 through May 1945, conducting thousands of sorties over occupied Europe and Germany. The strategic bombing campaign remains controversial. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died in the raids, while Bomber Command itself suffered catastrophic casualties, with over 55,000 airmen killed, missing, or captured out of approximately 125,000 who served. At Allerton, staff officers wrestled with terrible decisions: which cities to bomb, how many aircraft to send, acceptable loss rates. They tracked returning bombers through long nights, noting which crews made it back, which were reported missing, calculating success rates and planning the next night's operations. The castle witnessed the bureaucratic face of modern war, not the glory of medieval combat that its Gothic architecture evoked, but the grim mathematics of attrition: tonnage dropped, cities burned, young men lost. When victory finally came in May 1945, Allerton returned to civilian life, but the war had left its mark. The building showed wear from years of military occupation, damage to floors and walls from heavy equipment, alterations to accommodate military needs, general deterioration from housing far more people than it was designed for. The Storton family, now holding the title Baron Mowbray as well through inheritance, faced the daunting prospect of restoration in an England exhausted by 6 years of total war. The post-war period brought new challenges for England's aristocratic families. The Labour government elected in 1945 dramatically increased taxation on wealth and land. Country houses became financial liabilities rather than assets, their maintenance costs exceeding any conceivable income they might generate. Dozens of great houses were demolished in the 1950s and 1960s, blown up, torn down, abandoned to decay as their owners concluded that preservation was impossible. Allerton survived, but barely. The family continued to occupy the castle through the 1950s and into the 1960s, but the strain was evident. In 1965, the contents were sold at auction. Furniture, paintings, decorative objects accumulated over generations, dispersed to collectors and dealers, another aristocratic collection scattered to the winds. This sale represented more than financial necessity. It was an admission that the old way of life, the assumption that great houses would pass intact, from generation to generation forever, was finished. The 22nd Baron Stourton died, and the family ceased to live at Allerton permanently. The castle remained in family ownership, but fell into that ambiguous status, afflicting so many historic houses, technically private property but no longer truly a home, too expensive to maintain properly, too important to abandon completely, existing in limbo while the family searched for solutions. By the early 1980s, the situation had become untenable. The family made the difficult decision that countless aristocratic families before them had faced. Allerton must be sold. But to whom? What buyer could possibly be found for a massive Victorian Gothic castle in Yorkshire, incomplete in many areas, expensive to heat and maintain, far from London, suitable for no obvious commercial purpose? The answer came from an unexpected direction: America. In 1983, Dr. Gerald Rolf, an American businessman, saw what others had missed: not a burden, but an opportunity; not a white elephant, but a masterpiece waiting to be completed. Dr. Rolf's purchase of Allerton Castle marks the beginning of the estate's modern chapter, a story of restoration, dedication, and the realization, 127 years late, of the vision the 19th Baron Stourton had conceived in 1843. Dr. Gerald Rolf was not a typical buyer of English country houses. He was an American businessman, a self-made man whose success had provided the resources to indulge what some might consider an eccentric passion: the preservation of historic architecture. When he visited Allerton Castle in the early 1980s, he saw beyond the peeling paint, the unfinished rooms, the decades of deferred maintenance. He saw the magnificence of George Martin's design, the quality of the Victorian craftsmanship, the unrealized potential of a building that had waited more than a century for completion. The purchase in 1983 included the house and gardens, but not the surrounding park, which was retained by Lord Mowbray. This arrangement made practical sense. Dr. Rolf's focus was the building itself, not agricultural land management, but it also symbolically divided the estate, separating the Gothic palace from the landscape it had been designed to dominate. Dr. Rolf's first challenge was assessment. What would it take to restore Allerton not merely to habitability, but to the splendor George Martin had envisioned? The answer was daunting: comprehensive structural repairs, installation of modern heating and electrical systems, restoration of damaged decorative elements, and, most ambitiously, completion of the interiors that had been left unfinished in 1856. The work proceeded systematically, guided by architectural historians and skilled craftsmen. Dr. Rolf insisted on the highest standards, refusing to cut corners or accept modern shortcuts that would compromise historical authenticity. Original materials were sourced wherever possible. When the library's bookcases needed reconstruction, craftsmen worked from George Martin's original designs, using traditional joinery techniques. When decorative plasterwork required restoration, specialists studied Victorian methods, mixing lime plaster by hand, moulding ornamental details using techniques unchanged since the 19th century. The ballroom on the castle's west side presented a particular challenge. When Dr. Rolf acquired Allerton, this grand space remained exactly as the 19th Baron Storton had left it in 1856. Bare masonry walls, the structural shell complete but no decorative finish. For 127 years, this room had waited, a stone box promising beauty but delivering only potential. Dr. Rolf commissioned a magnificent plaster vaulted ceiling, transforming the bare chamber into a space worthy of the castle's grandest occasions. This was not mere restoration, but completion, finishing what Baron Stourton had begun but lacked funds to achieve. Throughout the restoration, Dr. Rolf filled the house with furniture and pictures of appropriate scale and splendor. Victorian country houses required furnishings that matched their architectural drama. Massive tables that could seat 30 or 40 guests, mirrors large enough to reflect entire rooms, portraits life-size or larger, decorative objects substantial enough to register in rooms with 20-foot ceilings. Dr. Rolf scoured auctions and dealers, acquiring pieces that would have been at home in Allerton during its Victorian heyday. The drawing room received portraits by Michael Dahl and Charles Jervis, 18th-century masters, whose work represented the aristocratic taste the Storton family would have known. Vast rococo mirrors, originally made for Melton Constable Hall in Norfolk, were installed, their ornate gilded frames and substantial size perfectly suited to Allerton's scale. The dining room's huge table, original to the house, was preserved and embellished with candelabra dating from 1848, contemporary with the castle's construction, their design echoing the Gothic Revival aesthetic of the building itself. The library required special attention after the 1965 contents sale had dispersed the original book collection. Dr. Rolf commissioned new bookcases based on George Martin's designs, built in an on-site workshop where craftsmen could work directly on the building, adjusting details to ensure perfect fit and finish. The wallpaper was based on one of Augustus Pugin's designs for the Houses of Parliament, a direct connection to the Gothic Revival movement that had inspired Allerton's creation. The ceiling was repainted in original colours, research having revealed the Victorian colour scheme beneath later overpainting. The Great Hall, that soaring space nearly 70 feet high, lit by its enormous central lantern, was restored to serve as Allerton's ceremonial heart, just as George Martin had intended. The intricately carved oak panelling was cleaned and repaired, revealing the quality of Victorian woodwork. Stained glass windows were conserved, their coloured light once again illuminating the space as it had in the 1850s. The galleried landings, their walls hung with full-length portraits including works by Michael Dahl and William Dobson, created that sense of ancestral presence that Victorian Gothic sought to evoke. By the early 2000s, Dr. Rolf's restoration was largely complete. Allerton Castle had been transformed from a deteriorating relic into a functioning, magnificent example of Victorian Gothic architecture. The Gerald Arthur Rolf Foundation for Historic Preservation and Education, established to ensure the building's long-term survival, took over management. Rooms became available for hire for corporate events and weddings, generating income to support ongoing maintenance, while allowing the public to experience the castle's splendor. The strategy seemed sound, private stewardship supported by commercial use, avoiding the institutional deadness of a museum while preventing the deterioration of abandonment. Allerton had found its modern purpose, a sustainable model for the 21st century. Then, on a freezing January night in 2005, disaster struck. January 2005. The exact date is lost to records, but the details of that night remain vivid for those who witnessed them. Fire broke out in the north aspect of Allerton Castle, the section housing some of the building's most important rooms, the main dining room, the library, the rear entrance hall, 2 bedrooms with adjoining dressing rooms and bathrooms, and part of the servants' wing. Fire in a historic building is every preservationist's nightmare. Victorian structures, for all their solidity, contain countless combustible materials. Timber floors and roof structures, wooden panelling, old textiles, centuries of accumulated paint and varnish. Once fire takes hold, it can spread with terrifying speed through voids in walls and ceilings, hidden spaces where flames travel unseen until entire sections are engulfed. At Allerton that January night, flames consumed the main dining room, where Baron Stourton's guests had dined beneath stained glass windows bearing the Mowbray and Stourton coats of arms. The huge table, original to the house, the 1848 candelabra, the oak panelling, all threatened by fire. The library, so recently restored with its Prussian-inspired wallpaper and reconstructed bookcases. Dr. Rolf's craftsmen had worked for years on those details, now faced destruction. The bookcases themselves, together with the books they contained, would be destroyed completely, reduced to ash and charred fragments. Firefighters battled the blaze through the frozen night. In rural Yorkshire, with the nearest fire stations miles away, precious time elapsed before equipment and personnel arrived in force. The castle's isolation, so prized for its romantic quality, now became a liability. Water supplies were limited. Access for fire trucks was challenging. The building's complex Victorian layout, with its multiple levels and interconnected spaces, made it difficult to determine where fire was spreading, which areas needed immediate attention, where collapse might be imminent. By dawn, the fire was controlled, but the damage was catastrophic. The north aspect of the castle, a substantial section of the building, was gutted. Roofs had collapsed, exposing interiors to the elements. Stone walls, though standing, were damaged by intense heat, their structural integrity compromised. Windows had shattered, their ornate stonework cracked and spalled. Water damage from firefighting efforts extended beyond the burned areas, threatening decorative plasterwork and finishes throughout adjacent rooms. Standing in the ruins that winter morning, surveying the destruction, one might have concluded that Dr. Rolf's restoration had been in vain. 2 decades of work, millions of dollars invested, countless hours of craftsman's labour, all seemingly undone in a single night. Many historic buildings damaged this severely are demolished as beyond economic repair. The fire appeared to mark the end of Allerton's story, final proof that even dedicated private stewardship could not overcome the fragility of historic architecture. Dr. Rolf saw otherwise. In the spring of 2006, restoration work commenced. The project's scope was enormous. Substantial repairs to ornate stonework and windows, installation of new floors at first, second and attic levels, significant structural steelwork to replace compromised timber elements, a new roof structure matching the original design, complete renewal of electrical, plumbing and heating systems, and restoration of decorative plasterwork throughout the damaged areas. Specialist contractors were engaged, firms with experience in historic building conservation and the technical skills required for this level of complexity. Stone conservators assessed every surface, determining which elements could be repaired and which required replacement. The damaged windows, with their elaborate Gothic tracery, had to be reconstructed, each piece of stonework carved to match original patterns. This was not mass production, but individual craftsmanship, each window essentially a bespoke creation. The floor structure required complete rebuilding. Victorian floors typically consisted of heavy timber joists supporting floorboards, often with elaborate decorative ceilings on the underside, the ceiling of one room forming from the floor structure of the room above. The fire had destroyed not just floors, but the three-dimensional architectural composition of multiple levels. Rebuilding required precise measurement, careful design to ensure new steelwork could be concealed within historical proportions, integration of modern services, electrical wiring, heating pipes, fire suppression systems, within spaces designed long before such systems existed. The roof structure posed particular challenges. Victorian roofs were sophisticated timber constructions, principal rafters, purlins, trusses, all sized and positioned according to structural calculations and traditional building practice. The new roof had to match the existing sections exactly, same pitch, same appearance, same structural logic, while incorporating modern materials and techniques for enhanced fire resistance. This tension between historical authenticity and modern safety requirements runs through every historic building restoration, requiring constant negotiation between competing priorities. The library's reconstruction was particularly poignant. The original bookcases, so recently built to George Martin's designs, were completely destroyed. Dr. Rolf's craftsmen returned to their workshop, pulled out the same drawings, and began again. The Pugin-inspired wallpaper, now ash, was researched and reproduced. The ceiling, its original colours so carefully researched and applied, was repainted once more, this time with additional documentation to guide any future restoration. The work consumed years. Restoration of this quality cannot be rushed. Skilled craftsmen are scarce. Materials require time to source and prepare. Techniques demand patience. Traditional lime plaster must cure slowly, allowing moisture to evaporate gradually. Stone carving proceeds at the pace of hand tools and careful judgment. Decorative painting requires multiple layers, each drying completely before the next application. But gradually, room by room, the fire damage was erased. By the early 2010s, restoration was described as more or less complete, that careful phrase acknowledging that historic buildings are never truly finished, that maintenance and conservation form an ongoing commitment rather than a project with a definite endpoint. Today, visitors to Allerton Castle would struggle to identify which sections burned in 2005. The restoration work by specialist contractors was executed to such high standards that fire-damaged areas are indistinguishable from original fabric. The library stands again, its bookcases faithful to Martin's designs, its Pugin wallpaper recreating Victorian splendor. The dining room has been reconstructed, ready once more to host banquets beneath stained glass. The bedrooms, dressing rooms and bathrooms are restored, demonstrating Victorian domestic arrangements to modern eyes accustomed to very different spatial organisation. The castle continues to operate under the Gerald Arthur Rolf Foundation for historic preservation and education, rooms available for corporate events and weddings, the revenue streams supporting ongoing maintenance and conservation. Allerton has found sustainable life in the 21st century, neither a museum frozen in time nor a private residence inaccessible to the public, but a living historic building that serves contemporary needs while honouring its Victorian past. To fully appreciate Allerton Castle, we must now conduct a detailed architectural tour, examining the building room by room, understanding how George Martin's design functions, how Victorian craftsmanship created beauty at every scale, how the building's spaces work together to create a coherent whole. The visitor's experience begins not at the castle, but on the approach drive, a short route that passes first the late 18th century stable block, survivor from an earlier building phase, its Georgian restraint contrasting with the Victorian Gothic exuberance ahead. This stable block, with its symmetrical facade and classical proportions, reminds us that Allerton's history encompasses multiple architectural eras, that the Gothic castle we see today arose from earlier structures whose ghosts haunt the site. Then the Tudor Gothic Victorian building reveals itself. The effect is calculated and dramatic. The main block, built of dark-coloured stone, presents a facade of romantic irregularity. The high tower rising above the entrance porch dominates the composition, drawing the eye upward, emphasising vertical thrust in classic Gothic fashion. This tower serves no defensive purpose. It contains rooms, certainly, but its primary function is symbolic and aesthetic, announcing Allerton's presence, claiming lordship over the landscape in visual language borrowed from medieval castles. The tower exemplifies Victorian Gothic design principles. It is tall, dramatically vertical, topped with battlements and decorative stonework that creates a picturesque silhouette. Small windows puncture its walls at irregular intervals, suggesting the thickness of the walls themselves, creating that sense of massive solidity that medieval architecture conveyed. The entrance porch beneath the tower is deeply recessed, almost tunnel-like, emphasising the building's mass, the sense of crossing a threshold from ordinary space outside to extraordinary space within. To the right of the main block, a lower brick range houses the chapel built by the 17th Baron Stourton in 1807 and retained when George Martin constructed his Gothic palace. This juxtaposition, earlier Gothic in brown and cream brick beside later Gothic Revival in dark stone, creates visual interest through contrast while demonstrating architectural continuity, the later building literally incorporating and embracing the earlier structure. Behind, barely visible from the main approach, extend the lower buildings of the service courtyard, dating from the 18th century. These utilitarian structures lack the architectural drama of the main castle, but were equally essential to its functioning. Victorian country house life required vast logistical support, food storage and preparation, laundry facilities, housing for servants, workshops for maintenance and repairs. These service areas, typically hidden from view or disguised behind screens, formed a separate world where the labour that made aristocratic leisure possible was conducted out of sight. Crossing the threshold, passing through the tunnel-like entrance beneath the tower, the visitor enters Allerton's most spectacular space, the galleried Great Hall, nearly 70 feet, 21 metres high, one of the highest baronial halls in England. The impact is immediate and overwhelming. Victorian architects understood drama, understood how to manipulate space and light to create emotional response. The Great Hall achieves this through sheer vertical scale. Standing at ground level, looking up through galleries to the enormous lantern far above, the visitor experiences what Gothic cathedrals induce: awe at architectural ambition, humility before massive construction, wonder at human capacity to build such spaces. The lantern itself is an engineering and artistic marvel. This huge glazed structure rises from the centre of the main block, flooding the hall with natural light from above, while creating a vertical shaft of luminosity that emphasizes the room's height. On sunny days, light pours down in dramatic shafts. On cloudy days, the hall glows with diffused brightness. At night, with modern lighting, the lantern reverses function, becoming a beacon visible for miles, announcing Allerton's presence in the dark Yorkshire countryside. The walls are adorned with intricately carved oak panelling, miles of it, extending up through multiple levels, each panel individually crafted, the cumulative effect one of overwhelming richness. This panelling demonstrates Victorian woodworking at its finest: tight joints, complex mouldings, decorative details carved by hand, all executed in oak, hard, durable, expensive, the traditional material of English prestige woodwork. The oak has darkened over 170 years, acquiring that rich brown patina that Victorians prized, suggesting age and permanence. Stained glass windows puncture the walls at intervals, their coloured light providing jewel-like accents in the oak-dominated space. Victorian stained glass combined medieval inspiration with 19th century technical advances. Richer colours, more complex compositions, use of painted details on glass surfaces to achieve effects impossible for medieval glaziers. The windows at Allerton likely depict heraldic devices, Gothic decorative patterns, possibly religious scenes appropriate to the Catholic family who commissioned them. The galleried landings that surround the hall at upper levels serve multiple functions. They provide circulation between rooms on upper floors. They create architectural interest through layering of horizontal elements within the dominant vertical space, and they display the ancestral portraits that were essential to Victorian aristocratic identity. Full-length portraits by Michael Dahl and William Dobson hang on these landing walls, their scale appropriate to the hall's grandeur. These paintings represent not just artistic achievement, but genealogical pride, the faces of ancestors, the continuity of family, the visible manifestation of inherited status. The Great Hall functions as Allerton's ceremonial heart and circulation hub. All major rooms open from it, or from the principal staircase that rises from it. This centralised plan derives from medieval great halls, which served as the functional and symbolic centre of castle life. George Martin adapted this medieval model to Victorian needs. The hall no longer served for communal dining. Victorian class distinctions required separation between family and servants, but it retained ceremonial importance as reception space, as impressive introduction to the castle's wonders, as architectural statement of the owner's wealth and taste. Opening from the Great Hall, the principal staircase provides access to upper floors while creating another opportunity for architectural display. Victorian staircases were prestige elements, often consuming vast cubic footage and enormous resources to achieve effects that were primarily symbolic. Allerton's staircase exemplifies this Victorian approach, wide enough for multiple people ascending side by side, constructed of expensive materials, embellished with carved details, lit by large windows, topped by another vaulted ceiling, hung with portraits of the Mowbray and Storton families. This staircase tells a story through portraits. As guests ascended to upper floors, they passed faces of ancestors, a visual genealogy, a reminder that they visited not just a house but a family seat with centuries of history, lineages extending back to Norman conquest, through the Mauleverers, and medieval Catholic nobility, through the Stourtons. These portraits were not mere decoration but historical documents, proof of family antiquity, assertion of inherited right to status and privilege. The vaulted ceiling above the staircase demonstrates Victorian mastery of Gothic structural forms. A vault is fundamentally a stone or masonry arch extended in 3 dimensions, using the principle of compression to span space without intermediate supports. Medieval masons developed increasingly complex vaulting systems: barrel vaults, groin vaults, rib vaults, fan vaults, each solving structural problems while creating distinctive aesthetic effects. Victorian Gothic revivalists studied these medieval forms intensely, sometimes reproducing them archaeologically, sometimes creating new variations that maintained Gothic structural logic while exploiting 19th century materials and techniques. Occupying the north side of the Great Hall, the section destroyed in the 2005 fire and subsequently restored, the library and dining room demonstrate Victorian domestic arrangements for intellectual and social life. The library represents the Victorian ideal of masculine retreat, a room for serious reading, for contemplation, for the management of estate business, lined with books that signified both learning and wealth. Victorian aristocrats were expected to maintain substantial libraries, collections running to thousands or tens of thousands of volumes encompassing classics of literature, history, theology, philosophy, science, plus bound volumes of periodicals, genealogical records, estate documents. The library at Allerton features bookcases based on George Martin's original designs so valued that when the originals burned in 2005, Dr. Rolf commissioned exact reproductions rather than improvising new designs. These bookcases demonstrate Victorian architectural woodwork, substantial construction capable of supporting thousands of pounds of books, decorative elements consistent with the building's Gothic character, practical features like adjustable shelves and glazed doors to protect valuable volumes from dust and light. The wallpaper, based on one of Augustus Pugin's designs for the Houses of Parliament, creates visual richness while asserting Gothic Revival pedigree. Pugin's wallpaper designs were influential throughout Victorian Gothic architecture, their patterns based on medieval precedents, but adapted to modern printing techniques, their colours drawn from the rich, saturated palette that Victorians believed authentic to medieval taste. To use Pugin-derived wallpaper at Allerton was to proclaim allegiance to Gothic Revival principles, to demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of the movement's sources and standards. The ceiling's original colours, carefully researched and recreated during restoration, likely include deep reds, blues, greens and golds, colours that modern taste might find overwhelming, but that Victorian Gothic enthusiasts embraced as authentic to medieval practice. The Gothic Revival was not subtle. It celebrated richness, complexity, density of pattern and colour, rejecting Georgian restraint as cold and lifeless. The dining room, also destroyed and restored after the 2005 fire, represents Victorian social life at its most formal. The panelling creates an enclosed, serious atmosphere appropriate to the ceremonial consumption of multi-course meals lasting hours. Stained glass windows bearing the Mowbray and Storton coats of arms assert family identity, while filtering natural light into coloured patterns. The huge table, original to the house, could accommodate dozens of guests, essential for the Victorian aristocratic practice of house parties, where dozens of visitors might stay for days or weeks, requiring daily formal dinners with precisely observed protocols of precedence, seating arrangement, service choreography. The 1848 candelabra demonstrate the importance Victorians placed on table appointments. Silver candlesticks were not merely functional but symbolic, their precious metals signifying wealth, their design demonstrating taste, their polished surfaces catching candlelight to create that warm, flickering illumination that Victorians preferred for evening dining. Electric lighting, when it arrived, was initially resisted in dining rooms precisely because it lacked candlelight's romantic quality. The drawing room, its name derived from withdrawing room, the space to which ladies withdrew after dinner, while men remained in the dining room for port and cigars, represents Victorian ideals of feminine domesticity. This was the lady of the house's domain, decorated to her taste, used for her social activities, afternoon tea, musical performances, conversation, needlework. Allerton's drawing room features a magnificent plaster ceiling, an exercise in Victorian decorative art. Victorian plasterers were capable of extraordinary complexity, creating ceilings that combined geometric patterns, naturalistic flowers and foliage, heraldic devices, Gothic-inspired details, all executed in white or subtly tinted plaster, the relief catching light to create constantly changing patterns as sun moved across the sky or candlelight flickered. The walls display portraits by Michael Dahl and Charles Jervis, 18th century artists whose works the Stourton family likely inherited or acquired to suggest aristocratic continuity. The visual claim that this Victorian family possessed collection worthy of earlier aristocratic generations. The vast Rococo mirrors from Melton Constable Hall in Norfolk demonstrate the Victorian practice of acquiring architectural elements and furnishings from other historic houses, essentially cannibalizing older buildings to embellish newer ones. These mirrors are substantial, tall enough to reflect standing figures full length, wide enough to span significant wall sections, their ornate gilded frames exemplifying Rococo taste for asymmetry, elaborate scrollwork, playful decorative elements. In the drawing room's context, they multiply space visually, reflect light to brighten the interior, and demonstrate the owner's ability to acquire prestigious objects. The ballroom in the castle's west side tells a particularly interesting story about Allerton's incomplete Victorian construction and 20th century completion. When the 19th Baron Stourton's money ran out in 1856, this space was left as bare masonry, walls and structure complete, but no decorative finish. Lord Mowbray and Stourton, the family's later representative, maintained this state, apparently seeing no need to complete what his Victorian ancestor had begun. Dr. Rolf's decision to finally finish the ballroom, more than 140 years after work halted, represents a fascinating moment in Allerton's history. The Victorian vision fulfilled by American patronage in the late 20th century. The plaster-vaulted ceiling Dr. Rolf commissioned creates the effect George Martin likely intended, a space of celebration and social performance, architecturally distinguished, capable of hosting the balls and dances that were central to Victorian aristocratic social life. Victorian balls were elaborate affairs, orchestras, hundreds of guests, dancing that continued past midnight, supper served in early morning hours, protocols governing every aspect from invitation lists to dance partners to appropriate dress. A proper ballroom required substantial cubic footage, space for dancing couples, for spectators around the perimeter, for the orchestra, for decorative arrangements. The plaster vault creates this sense of volume while providing acoustic qualities appropriate to music and conversation. On the entrance side of the castle, the billiard room, music room and morning room demonstrate the Victorian multiplication of specialised spaces. Unlike earlier Georgian houses where rooms served multiple purposes, Victorian houses increasingly featured rooms dedicated to specific activities. The billiard room represents masculine recreation. Billiards was a gentleman's game, requiring dedicated space with proper table, lighting and atmosphere. The music room, housing a collection of late 19th and early 20th century automatic musical instruments, demonstrates Victorian fascination with mechanical music, player pianos, orchestrions, music boxes, devices that could produce complex musical performances through clockwork mechanisms or pneumatic systems. These instruments represented both technological achievement and social aspiration, the ability to have music without employing musicians, to demonstrate sophistication through mechanical marvels. The morning room served for informal family gatherings, particularly breakfast and lunch, less formal than the dining room but more comfortable than eating in the Great Hall or other public spaces. Victorian domestic life carefully calibrated formality, state dinners in the dining room, family dinners also in the dining room but with less elaborate service, informal meals in the morning room or breakfast room, absolute informality, rarely acknowledged in public, might mean eating in private sitting rooms or even bedrooms. The chapel, added in 1807 by the 17th Baron Storton and retained when George Martin rebuilt the castle, deserves special attention as the spiritual heart of this Catholic family's domain. The chapel's integration into the house, entrance directly from the main building, balcony access from the master bedroom, reflects both convenience and the somewhat ambiguous status of Catholics in early 19th century England. Catholic emancipation did not arrive until 1829, 22 years after this chapel's construction. Before then, Catholic worship technically remained illegal, though enforcement varied with political circumstances and local attitudes. Having a private chapel within one's own house provided security and discretion. Worship could occur without public advertisement, without dependence on the few Catholic churches that existed, without exposure to potential hostility. The chapel's Gothic style, that earlier, more playful version of Gothic Revival, reflects early 19th century antiquarian taste, the beginning of Gothic architecture's rehabilitation from its 18th century dismissal as barbarous and medieval. By choosing Gothic for his chapel, Baron Storton made a statement. Gothic architecture was Christian architecture, connected to the Catholic Middle Ages that preceded Protestant Reformation, symbolically asserting continuity with the pre-Reformation English Church. The chapel's brown and cream brick construction creates warmth and domesticity, very different from the cold stone of many Protestant churches. The lancet windows, tall, narrow-pointed, provide that upward drawing quality that Gothic architecture exploits, directing worshippers' eyes and thoughts heavenward. The east end's three blind lancets, lancet-shaped recesses in the wall without actual openings, provide visual rhythm while maintaining the solid wall behind the altar, focusing attention on the liturgical action rather than exterior views. The balcony above the entrance, with access from the master bedroom, allowed the Baron and his wife to observe Mass, while remaining separate from household members and any guests in the chapel below. This physical separation reflected social hierarchies that Victorians maintained even in religious contexts. The Lord and Lady occupied one sphere, their dependents another, and architecture enforced these distinctions through spatial organisation. The chapel received Grade II listing in 1985, recognising its historical and architectural importance. This designation, one step below the highest Grade I listing that the castle itself holds, protects the chapel from alteration or demolition, ensuring its preservation as part of Allerton's layered history. Though not part of the castle proper, no account of Allerton would be complete without detailed attention to the Temple of Victory, that extraordinary folly visible from the A1 motorway, perched atop its 200-foot artificial hill. The temple's octagonal plan and Palladian design contrast completely with the castle's Gothic architecture, representing an earlier aesthetic. The 18th century veneration of classical antiquity, the belief that ancient Roman and Greek architecture achieved perfection that later ages should emulate. Palladian architecture, named for Andrea Palladio, the 16th century Italian architect whose treatises influenced English building for 2 centuries, emphasizes symmetry, proportion, classical orders, columns with their specific capitals and bases, harmony of parts. An octagonal plan allows 8 equal facades, each with the same architectural treatment, creating perfect symmetry from every approach angle. The columns, probably Ionic or Corinthian order, given the building's date and purpose, support a dome or pyramidal roof. The exact form is unclear from historical descriptions. The whole composition demonstrating that mastery of classical vocabulary that 18th century education emphasized. The temple's function was purely aesthetic and contemplative, a destination for walks through the park, a viewpoint from which to survey the landscape, a picturesque object to be viewed from the house and grounds, creating that idealized classical past that 18th century landscape design sought to evoke. Follies like the Temple of Victory represented romantic sensibility, the appreciation of landscape as picture, the creation of artificial ruins or temples to enhance natural scenery, the leisured aristocrats' ability to shape their environment for aesthetic pleasure. The 200-foot hill itself represents enormous expenditure of labour. Moving thousands of tons of earth using only human muscle, wheelbarrows and horse carts required months or years of work by dozens or hundreds of labourers. The resulting hill permanently altered the landscape, creating an artificial prominence where none existed naturally, demonstrating the landowner's power to remake nature itself. From the A1 motorway today, drivers see the Temple of Victory's silhouette against the sky. A startling sight, this classical temple on its improbable hill, surrounded by Yorkshire farmland. Few drivers know the story behind what they glimpse: the Duke of York's brief ownership, the possible origin of a nursery rhyme, the centuries of landscape history encoded in this strange monument. To fully appreciate Allerton Castle, we must understand its position within the broader Gothic Revival movement that transformed English architecture in the 19th century. The Gothic Revival was more than an architectural style. It was a cultural movement encompassing literature, art, religion, politics, social philosophy. It represented rejection of Enlightenment rationalism and classical aesthetics in favour of medieval emotion, spirituality, and organic architecture. It was driven by nostalgia for pre-industrial society, by reaction against mechanisation and urban squalor, by religious impulses, both Catholic and Anglican, by nationalism that saw Gothic as England's indigenous architecture in contrast to imported classicism. The movement's origins trace to the mid-18th century, when writers like Horace Walpole began romanticising medieval architecture. Walpole's Strawberry Hill, begun 1749, applied Gothic decorative elements to a suburban villa, creating that playful Gothic style seen in Allerton's chapel. But this early phase was largely superficial. Gothic details applied to buildings that remained essentially classical in structure and conception. The movement's serious phase began in the 1830s and 1840s, driven by Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin's passionate advocacy. Pugin argued that Gothic was not merely a style, but the only architecturally and morally true form of Christian building. His books Contrasts, 1836, and The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, 1841, became manifestos for the movement, influencing an entire generation of architects and patrons. Pugin's work on the Palace of Westminster, with Charles Barry, begun after the 1834 fire, provided the movement's most visible achievement. Here was Gothic architecture applied to the nation's most important secular building, Gothic proclaimed as Britain's national style. The Palace of Westminster's success inspired countless imitations, from major public buildings to private houses. Country houses like Allerton Castle represent the Gothic Revival's domestic application. Victorian aristocrats building new houses or remodelling old ones faced stylistic choice: classical or Gothic? The choice carried meaning. Classical architecture suggested Enlightenment values, cosmopolitan European culture, Whig political tradition. Gothic suggested medieval values, English nationalism, Tory political sympathies, often Catholic or High Anglican religious orientation. For the Catholic Stourton family, Gothic was natural choice. The medieval period represented Catholic England, before Reformation and religious persecution. To build Gothic was to assert continuity with that Catholic past, to reject Protestant classical tradition, to create architecture that embodied Catholic values of community, tradition, hierarchy, ritual. George Martin, designing Allerton, worked within established Gothic Revival vocabulary while creating something distinctive. His Tudor Gothic style combined Perpendicular Gothic's vertical drama with Tudor domestic details, creating architecture that was recognisably English, not French or German Gothic, and appropriate to a country house rather than a church. The Great Hall's vertical drama echoed medieval baronial halls, asserting feudal continuity. The dark stone suggested age and permanence, refusing Georgian preference for light-coloured stone that looked new and clean. The asymmetrical silhouette, tower, varying roof heights, irregular fenestration, rejected classical symmetry in favour of organic growth, building that seemed to have evolved over centuries rather than being designed in a moment. This appearance of organic growth was entirely calculated. Victorian Gothic Revival architects studied medieval buildings intensely, learning how they actually evolved: incremental addition, varied materials, functional irregularity. Then they designed new buildings to look similarly evolved, creating instant history through architectural sophistication. Allerton Castle must be understood in context of contemporary Gothic Revival houses. Highclere Castle, remodelled by Charles Barry 1842–1849. Tintersfield 1863–1866. Cardiff Castle, renovated by William Burgess 1866–1928. Nightshades Court 1869–1874. These buildings and dozens more represented Victorian aristocracy's embrace of Gothic aesthetics, their rejection of Georgian classicism as cold and lifeless. But the Gothic Revival's architectural triumph coincided with aristocratic decline. The very period when the greatest Gothic houses were being built, 1840s through 1880s, saw the beginning of forces that would make such houses unsustainable: agricultural depression reducing land income, rising taxation, social changes eroding aristocratic privilege, changing tastes eventually rejecting Victorian Gothic as heavy and oppressive. By the early 20th century, architectural fashion had moved on. The arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau, eventually modernism, each rejected Victorian Gothic's elaborate decoration and historical revivalism. Country houses like Allerton came to seem embarrassing relics, expensive white elephants consuming resources for no contemporary purpose. This is why Dr. Gerald Rolf's restoration matters so much. By the 1980s, when he purchased Allerton, Victorian Gothic architecture had been unfashionable for 70 years, dismissed as heavy-handed pastiche, its buildings demolitioned or abandoned across England. Rolf's decision to restore Allerton to the highest standards, to complete what the 19th Baron Storton had begun, represented vindication of Victorian Gothic ambitions, assertion that these buildings possessed enduring value beyond transient fashion. Today, Victorian Gothic has been substantially rehabilitated in critical estimation. Scholars appreciate the movement's complexity, its theoretical sophistication, the quality of its craftsmanship. Buildings like Allerton Castle are recognised as important cultural artefacts, evidence of Victorian aesthetics, technology, social structures, religious sensibilities. The style's extravagance, once criticised, now seems admirable, evidence of ambition, confidence, willingness to attempt grandeur. Understanding Allerton Castle requires imagining not just the building, but the life within it. How people inhabited these spaces, how architecture shaped daily existence, how social structures manifested in spatial organisation. When the Stourton family moved into the completed portions of their new castle in the 1850s, they enacted a carefully orchestrated domestic drama, whose rules seemed natural, but were actually elaborate social constructions. The family's day began separately for different members and servant classes. The Baron might rise early, breakfasting privately in his dressing room before attending to estate business in the library. The Baroness would breakfast later in the morning room, planning the day's household activities with the housekeeper. Children breakfasted in the nursery under their nanny's supervision, rarely seeing parents before mid-morning. Servants had risen hours earlier. Kitchen staff began work before dawn, lighting fires, preparing breakfast for family and servants' hall. Housemaids cleaned grates, laid new fires, emptied chamber pots — this was before modern plumbing — swept and dusted rooms before family members could encounter disorder. Footmen ensured dining room and public spaces were perfectly prepared. The butler supervised everything, maintaining standards, resolving conflicts, embodying the household's hierarchical order. By mid-morning, the house hummed with coordinated activity. The Baroness consulted with cook about meals, with housekeeper about supplies and servants' management, with head gardener about flowers and vegetables, with bailiff about estate, matters requiring her attention. The Baron rode the estate, met with his steward and tenant farmers, handled correspondence, perhaps travelled to York or London on business. Lunch was informal compared to dinner, often taken in the morning room, conversation relaxed. Afternoons might involve visiting neighbours, receiving guests for tea, an increasingly important social ritual as the 19th century progressed, walking the grounds, pursuing hobbies, watercolour painting for ladies, hunting or fishing for gentlemen. Dinner was the day's ceremonial climax. Dressing for dinner was obligatory. Men in evening dress, women in elaborate gowns, jewellery displayed, hair formally arranged. Guests assembled in the drawing room, conversation carefully modulated to avoid controversial topics. When the butler announced dinner, they processed to the dining room in order of precedence. Strict protocols determined who escorted whom, who sat where, who was served first. Dinner itself lasted hours. Multiple courses: soup, fish, entree, roast, game, dessert, savoury. Different wines with each course. Servants choreographed to serve and clear with perfect timing. Conversation regulated by social convention. Ladies dominated discussion during soup and fish courses. Men took conversational lead during roast and game. General conversation resumed for dessert. After dinner, ladies withdrew to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, leaving men to port, cigars, and male-only discussion in the dining room. When men rejoined ladies in the drawing room, the evening might continue with music, someone playing piano, amateur singers performing, cards, or simply conversation, until guests retired to their bedrooms around midnight. This daily ritual required enormous servant support. A house like Allerton might employ 40 to 60 staff: butler, under-butler, footman, housekeeper, housemaids, kitchen staff, chef, cooks, scullery maids, laundry maids, still-room maid, ladies' maids for the Baroness and any daughters, valets for the Baron and any sons, nursery staff for children, estate staff, gamekeeper, gardeners, grooms, coachmen, plus occasional specialists, seamstress, governess, tutor. These servants lived mostly in the service wing, eating in the servants' hall, with strict hierarchy determining seating and service order, sleeping in small bedrooms, often shared, working 6.5 days per week, receiving modest wages supplemented by tips from visiting guests. Their lives were entirely structured by the family's needs. They existed to enable aristocratic leisure, their labour invisible to guests who saw only the results: perfect service, spotless rooms, delicious meals appearing as if by magic. House parties were major events, sometimes lasting weeks, requiring months of preparation. Dozens of guests might arrive: aristocratic relatives and friends, political allies, potential marriage partners for children, useful social connections. Each guest brought their own servants, lady's maid or valet, straining the house's capacity. Meals became even more elaborate. Entertainment was arranged: amateur theatricals, dances, hunting expeditions. The castle showcased at its most impressive. This was the life the 19th Baron Storton envisioned when commissioning George Martin to build his Gothic palace, a stage set for aristocratic performance, architecture that made visible his family's status, taste, and values. By the Edwardian period, 1901-1910, and into the 1920s, this elaborate system was beginning to crack. The First World War, 1914-1918, accelerated changes already underway: agricultural depression reducing estate income, rising taxation, especially death duties, labour shortages as servants found better opportunities in cities or factories, social changes questioning aristocratic privilege. Maintaining Allerton became increasingly difficult. Servant numbers declined, not by choice but by necessity, as both wages rose and recruitment became harder. Rooms were closed to save heating costs. Entertaining was simplified. The family spent more time in London or abroad, treating Allerton as occasional retreat rather than permanent residence. The Second World War's arrival brought radical transformation. The military requisition that turned Allerton into RAF Bomber Command headquarters essentially ended aristocratic occupation. The Stourton family, now also Barons Mowbray through inheritance, moved out, their Gothic palace becoming an operations centre for modern industrial warfare. Imagine the contrast. Rooms designed for Victorian elegance now filled with utilitarian military furniture, operations maps, communication equipment. The Great Hall's acoustic properties, designed to enhance polite conversation and musical performances, now amplified military briefings and telephones' urgent ringing. The drawing room's plaster ceiling looked down on Canadian officers planning bombing raids. The dining room served meals to young airmen, many of whom would die in the skies over Germany. The castle witnessed the bureaucracy of war: reports typed, orders issued, lost statistics compiled, future operations planned. It heard accents from across Canada: prairie farmers, urban factory workers, French Canadians, indigenous peoples, young men far from home, serving in England's ancient landscape, working in a Victorian Gothic castle that must have seemed unreal compared to their familiar worlds. When war ended, the castle bore physical scars, damaged floors and walls, alterations to accommodate military needs, but also intangible changes. The building had proven capable of adaptation, of serving purposes its Victorian creators never imagined. The aristocratic life it was designed to house was finished, but the building itself could continue with new purposes. The post-war decades brought uncertainty and gradual decline. The Stourton Mowbray family attempted to maintain Allerton but faced impossible economics. The 1965 contents sale dispersed accumulated possessions, furniture, paintings, decorative objects, breaking up collections assembled over generations. The family ceased permanent residence after the 22nd Baron Storton's death, the castle kept but not truly lived in, existing in limbo between past and future. This period saw hundreds of British country houses demolished, not through war damage but through economic impossibility. Maintenance costs, taxation, lack of obvious modern purpose, changing social attitudes that rejected aristocratic privilege, all these factors made country houses seem obsolete. The architectural and historical value that seems obvious today was not yet widely recognised. Many magnificent buildings were simply torn down, their sites redeveloped, their contents scattered. Allerton survived partly through luck, partly through the family's reluctance to take the final step of demolition, partly through the building's quality that made it seem worth preserving, even when purpose was unclear. Dr. Gerald Rolf's 1983 purchase marks the beginning of Allerton's successful modern chapter. His restoration was not nostalgia for aristocratic life, but appreciation for architectural achievement. He didn't attempt to recreate Victorian social structures, impossible and undesirable, but to complete and preserve Victorian architectural vision. The castle today serves functions its Victorian creators never envisioned: corporate events, weddings, educational programs. This represents not betrayal of historical purpose, but successful adaptation. The building survives because it has found sustainable 21st century uses that generate revenue for ongoing maintenance, while allowing public access and appreciation. Modern visitors experience Allerton very differently from Victorian guests. They come for specific events, not extended house parties. They marvel at architectural details rather than accepting them as natural aristocratic entitlement. They photograph rooms that Victorian inhabitants would have considered private. They experience the building as museum and event space rather than home. Yet something essential survives: the building's capacity to impress, to demonstrate human ambition and craftsmanship, to connect present with past. Standing in the Great Hall, looking up to that soaring lantern, modern visitors feel something similar to what Victorian guests felt: awe at architectural achievement, wonder at beauty created through skill and resources, connection to historical continuity. Allerton Castle's story is ultimately about human ambition and the fragility of dreams. The Norman Maul-leverers who held these lands for 6 centuries left only tomb monuments and a memory. The Duke of York's brief ownership is remembered mainly through nursery rhyme legend. The Georgian mansion that once stood here has vanished completely, replaced by Gothic Victorian palace. The 19th Baron Stourton's grand vision went unrealised for 140 years, his money running out before completion, his castle remaining half-finished through Victorian and Edwardian eras, through 2 world wars, through post-war aristocratic decline. Only Dr. Gerald Rolf's American determination finally completed what Baron Storton began, finishing the ballroom, restoring fire damage, filling the house with appropriate furnishings. This layered history demonstrates both human ambition's power and its limitations. We can build magnificently, but our creations outlive our purposes. Allerton was designed for Victorian aristocratic life that ended decades ago. It has survived by adapting, by finding new purposes while maintaining architectural integrity. The 2005 fire and subsequent restoration symbolise this survival capacity. Fire could have ended Allerton's story. Many historic buildings damaged less severely are demolished as beyond repair. But commitment to preservation, mobilization of specialist skills, willingness to invest in restoration allowed the castle to rise phoenix-like, fire damage erased, the building renewed. What does Allerton Castle mean in the 21st century? First, it is architectural achievement, a demonstration of Victorian Gothic Revival at its most ambitious. George Martin's design realized across 170 years, from 1843 initial construction through 2006-2011 fire restoration. It shows what 19th century craftsmanship could achieve: stonework, woodwork, plasterwork, all executed to standards rarely matched today. Second, it is historical witness. Allerton saw the Mauleverer's 6 centuries, the Duke of York's eccentric tenure, Catholic revival under the Stourtons, wartime transformation, post-war uncertainty, American restoration. These layers of history are readable in the building itself: the chapel from 1807, the stable block from the 18th century, the Victorian Gothic castle from 1843-1853, the completed ballroom from the 1990s, the fire restoration from 2006-2011. Third, it is testament to cultural values' changeability. The Gothic revival that inspired Allerton's construction fell from fashion within decades, dismissed as heavy-handed pastiche. Victorian Gothic architecture seemed embarrassing through most of the 20th century. Only recently has the style been rehabilitated in critical estimation, recognized as important cultural achievement rather than misguided excess. Fourth, it demonstrates private stewardship's potential. Dr. Rolf succeeded where institutional ownership might have failed, his personal commitment driving restoration to highest standards. The Gerald Arthur Rolf Foundation ensures ongoing preservation while allowing sustainable commercial use. This model, private foundation supporting historic building through event income, offers one solution to the challenge of country house preservation. Finally, Allerton Castle reminds us that buildings are not static objects, but living things that evolve, adapt, survive through human commitment. The castle standing today is both Victorian creation and modern restoration, both historical artifact and functioning building, both monument to past ambitions and demonstration of present dedication. In an age of disposable architecture, when buildings are routinely demolished after decades rather than centuries, when construction quality emphasizes economy over permanence, when our horizon often extends no further than immediate returns, Allerton Castle stands as counterexample. It proclaims that beauty matters, that craftsmanship matters, that connecting with history matters, that some things are worth preserving despite difficulty and expense. The Temple of Victory, visible from the motorway, still rises on its artificial hill, a monument to forgotten purposes, surviving through sheer physical presence and protected status. The castle itself, dark stone against Yorkshire skies, its high tower watching over landscape it no longer rules, continues serving purposes its builders never imagined. This is Allerton Castle's essential lesson: human creations outlive human intentions. We build for our purposes, but our buildings serve future generations whose purposes we cannot predict. Our responsibility is not to control future use, but to create and maintain quality sufficient to make future use possible. The 19th Baron Stourton built his Gothic palace for Victorian aristocratic life. Dr. Gerald Rolf restored it for late 20th century appreciation of architectural heritage. Future generations will find their own uses and meanings. The building endures, adapting, surviving, connecting past with future through physical presence and architectural beauty. In this survival, Allerton Castle achieves something its creators sought but could not guarantee: permanence. Not the unchanging permanence of stone and mortar, fire proved that illusion, but the permanence of cultural value, of beauty that transcends fashion, of human achievement that inspires continued commitment across generations. This is the true victory the temple commemorates, not military triumph but culture's persistence, architecture's capacity to survive changing purposes and meanings, beauty's power to inspire preservation despite difficulty and expense. Allerton Castle stands not because it was perfectly designed or perfectly built, but because successive generations have chosen to keep it standing, through restoration adaptation, and unwavering commitment to the belief that some things from the past deserve a future.